We're experiencing a mental health crisis in our country, globally as well. What can we do to support positive mental health growth? I'm here today with Sarah Downey, the president and CEO of CAMH, Canada's Addiction for Mental Health. And we're going to talk about this. It's going to get real. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Lee.
Thank you so much for joining me. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. It's not an easy one because so many people are impacted. Before we jump into mental health and addiction, I wanted to talk about you because you have been an extraordinary health leader, and now as the CEO of CAMH, and also previously at Michael Garron. I just want to talk about how you got to where you've gotten.
Thanks. Well, so I've been working in hospitals for 30 years, believe it or not. I did a Bachelor of Science many, many years ago. And when I was done my Bachelor of Science, I thought, I like business, but I want to find a business with a heart. And so I did a Master's in Health Administration at the University of Ottawa. And as I say, I'm a student of the healthcare system. And so upon graduation, I started working in hospitals. And I've had the great privilege of working in academic health science centers. I've worked in community hospitals. I've worked in cancer programs. I've worked in mental health, worked in, all kinds of different aspects of hospitals. And if I know anything, I suppose it's in a way how hospitals work and how the health system is organized and at times disorganized. But I'm a student of and passionate about healthcare systems.
Well, it really shows because even in your capacity as the CEO of Michael Garron Hospital, you really led a path towards growth and bringing multiple communities, stakeholders, partners together to make a vision happen.
Thank you.
And I see you doing this as we move into CAMH.
Yeah. Well, there's no lack of purpose and passion in the hospital system, that's for sure. And it's been a pleasure to serve it and serve the people who need healthcare for a long time now.
Yeah, no, for sure. We need more, right?
Yeah, we do.
I mean, so I think that with mental health and addiction, it's always been something that's there.
Yeah.
People kind of try not to talk about it because of the stigma associated with it. But since COVID, it just feels like when the world shut down, the isolation, the lack of social interaction and everything had a profound impact because things became more so, or whatever it was. And now as people get back to the real world, like back to work, back to school and all these things are showing up. And what is it a manifestation of?
Right.
I don't know, right? And a lot of it, I think, comes back down to mental health and addiction. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to ask you, what have you observed?
Yes.
What do you know from your seat?
Yeah. Well, there's been a stigma about mental illness and addiction problems, forever. And we're in an age where we're destigmatizing so much. I work for the organization that is the Mental Health is Health movement. And the idea that if you're struggling, you should seek help. And I'm not sure. It was bad before the pandemic. And I think the evidence is showing it's worst post-pandemic or in this peri-pandemic period because we're never quite out of it anymore.
Yeah.
And there's many different ways to look at that. And I don't know if we can quantify yet what all that will mean. But I think there are groups of people for sure who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and who show either signs of mental illness or early warning signs that this maybe is not okay for them. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I think anybody who experiences economic hardship as a result of the pandemic and maybe we're new to our country or vulnerable in some ways, probably experienced disproportionate hardship from those who had stable environments or stable homes, had jobs where you could work from home during the pandemic. And I think, seeing people sleeping in the TTC or under bridges or those kinds of things seems a lot more visible to me anyway. Maybe I see them differently now that I'm at CAMH, but I think there's a group of people like that. I think seniors became increasingly isolated.
Yeah.
And we know that isolation is a big predictor of things like advancing dementia and of wellness in seniors.
Yeah.
I felt it in the case of my own parents who lost many of their social structures and courage to go out, and the risk of COVID to older people was clear. And then for sure, we're seeing it in our young people. I think for a number of reasons. One is they're at the ages where socialization is an important part of their development, right? I can remember taking my child to the pediatrician during the pandemic for regular checkup. And she said to me, at 18 months, I checked to see whether kids can clap and wave. This was at the height of the pandemic. She says, at 18 months, they can clap, but many kids don't know how to wave. Because we're not socializing. When do you learn to wave? It's when you go to groups and you're in environments to say hi to people, or even seeing your grandparents or whoever that might be.
Yeah.
So I think we don't know what the impact of social isolation has been in the long run, but we're seeing really serious early warning signs that our young people are not okay. And I think that as society is something we really have to get our heads around.
Yes, as a parent to two young people, that really hits home, because you see that when they're in school now, virtual learning didn't really work for most people. No. Socialization. And we had a conversation earlier off camera just about how important it is to diagnose a few things before they hit a certain age. Can you talk about that?
So the really interesting thing from a healthcare system perspective about mental illness is that 70% of it is diagnosable before the brain is fully developed, which for most of it is about age 25, maybe 30.
Okay.
And so unlike cancer or heart disease, they're not primarily diseases of aging. In fact, I read an article recently that said mental health disorders are actually chronic diseases of the young.
Chronic disease of the young.
Yeah. So imagine 70% of this, if we could figure it out, is early warning signs before you're an adult. And CAMH for almost 40 years has done surveys every 2 years of grade 7 to grade 12 students. It's all on our website called the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey, where we asked young people, their hopes for the future, about their mental health, their physical health, their use of substances. And what we know actually is that, in the survey released in 2021, is that 59% of young people feel no hope for their future because of COVID-19. 50% feel no hope for the future because of climate change problems.
That's huge.
It's huge. We know that substance uses are up. 33% of kids in those age groups will use high energy drinks. They'll use alcohol. They have ready access to things in society. Many didn't learn very well through online schooling.
Yeah.
We don't have systems that have adapted to kids. I mean, I've heard, families saying my kid went to university without ever having really written an exam.
Yeah.
And
the anxiety, right?
The anxiety. So this is the age where this stuff presents itself, and we stress them out even more, and probably compromise their social development in some instance. And so I think we really have to hear and find the warning signs in our young people and start to figure out ways to address them early, to help them through it. Because, we know how the brain, increasingly we understand how the brain develops and the ages at which things happen. I would say when I was at Michael Garron Hospital, we opened an eating disorder program. I'd never heard of so many eating disorders. So many hospitals in Ontario set up these programs at the height of the pandemic. We see all
Why? Why do you think that happened?
Well, I suspect it's a complicated thing, right? It's what over time, we'll see often boys use more substances. We'll see girls control their eating in different ways, but it's a mental health disorder. It's their ways of expressing the things they're feeling. Yeah. And they're complicated illnesses now to treat at a time of their life where their bodies are developing and their brains are still growing, right? And we introduce things into their system they have that affect those brain development. So, I think as society, we've got to get our heads around how we're going to support young people. I was speaking to the colleague of mine who's at the U of T. I said 50% of students at the U of T report moderate to severe psychological distress.
So what do we do?
So as I say, this is a movement. It takes far more than a place like CAMH, which is a big hospital that treats mental health disorders and substance use problems, way more than a place like CAMH to help to solve this crisis. And I call it a crisis. I think every family doctor needs to know how to do this. I think, and I recognize the complexities of this, but every sports team, every family, every book club, every teacher, every university professor, I think we have to look for and find ways to identify symptoms of psychological struggle and find ways to get supports to people. We offer courses like Mental Health 101 at CAMH. We have lots of reasons to, but lots of tools to figure out the questions you ask people. Or people, we've talked about in our social circles, people reaching out for help is to know where to direct them to. Yeah. But I tell you, it takes everybody to address this.
And I think that's really important, of recognizing that there isn't like, just go to the hospital, right? And that'll be the solution. Societally, how do we recognize, like you had mentioned, like that there are signs, like what are some of the signs that we should be looking for?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I had lunch with a friend of mine the other day. Her kid just started at university. She has the tracking app on her phone, and she noticed her kid goes out to class, but then never leaves the residence. And she said, should I be worried about him? So the fact that you're raising this with me, you should be worried, because of his phone, that maybe maybe it's fine. Yeah. But maybe something's not right. Major psychotic illnesses present at the age at which kids start at university. It's just biological when, that point in their brains. So, I think we have to trust our guts. We have to look for these things. Things like, safe environment, enough sleep, keeping busy and structured are important things in life, but you've got to talk to young people.
What about social media?
Yeah. So for sure, the use of the phone, I have stats here from this survey. 83% of grades 7 to 12 students report 3+ hours per day of screen time. And the older you get, the more you spend on your phone.
Even adults. Like, I know so many parents who, after they put their kid to bed, they're doom scrolling. Yeah. And that's a part of like, stop being on social media. And people are trying to like log off of them. Yeah. And it's changed our attention span, but these are tough, right? Because all kids do this. Right. This is a generation whose brains will have been formed in this way. Right. Yeah. And so are we going to really ban phones? I don't know if we're ready to do that in society. It feels like a restriction of civil liberties, which we tend to feel pretty, strongly about in our country. It's an addiction, isn't it? Would one classify it? Like, so, I don't know. The dopamine hit of people liking a post that you did, or people turning things down and. Yeah. I've read about that. So we don't treat it as an addiction that way. We'd all be in treatment, I suppose, if we did. But things like online gambling is an example of addictions, or too much shopping online can be, you can certainly get into more trouble with your addiction because of, easy access to the phone and to ways to purchase and do things. So they are symptoms of addictions and underlying mental health challenges for sure. Well, I wanted to take a moment because I know you had such great clarity of like the top 3 things for mental health and addiction. Like, how do we address it? Yeah. So let's do on that, because I know that our conversation is going to go like this. Yeah. But right now, the top 3 things. The top 3 things I can think of is we all have to see ourselves as people who can help people in identifying mental health awareness. Yeah, awareness. What are behavioral signs in children we should be worried about? When should you be worried about your teenager? I'm a mother of teenagers, and is that really too much time in their rooms? Are they really? Yeah. So stay connected, identify early signs, and ask for help if you're worried about it. Yeah. Right. There's no harm in asking. Family doctors are equipped in these things. If you're really worried about somebody's safety,
hospital emergency departments.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not a great pathway into mental health care, but they are a path. CAMH has an emergency department, for instance. So do, many hospitals. But go to your family doctor if you're lucky enough to have one and talk to somebody. Don't bottle it up. And there's lots of resources online. Some are maybe questionable, but if you go to reliable websites.
All right. We've got to start with camh.ca.
Yeah, you can start with camh.ca. There's lots of great resources there. But ask for help. And if you're fearful for somebody's life, either the person with the illness or what they could do is to get help immediately, because it's what we know how to treat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So awareness, education, outreach.
Yeah. Stay connected. Yeah. Be open-minded.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that curiosity mindset.
Yeah, it is. Don't judge, be curious. It's a Ted Lasso quote. Be curious, not judgmental.
We'll talk about that after.
The great philosopher.
Yeah. In terms of recognizing what you just spoke about how this is something that is a movement.
Yeah.
What can parents how do we create that cycle of change? So let's say CAMH has been, is the leader, aware of this, right? Yeah. With all the research.
Yeah.
But how do we become the catalyst to support?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, so encourage your kids to go into the mental health professions. Obviously, we need a lot to learn about it yourself.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think is to be incredibly cognizant of is that if it exists in the children, it probably exists in you too. Right. I mean, there's some genetic links between people. And, as I remember speaking to a child psychiatrist, it's almost invariably when they've diagnosed a mental illness in a young person, they find it in one of the parents. Yeah. So it's not just them, it's us too. And take stock of, how you're feeling, your hope for the future.
Yeah.
And what you do to preserve your own mental wellness. And again, mental wellness is one end of the spectrum. And for sure, mindfulness or, physical exercise and good sleep are all good things to promote your own mental wellness.
Yeah.
But mental illnesses are also things that won't be cured by mindfulness and yoga. And,
I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, they're illnesses. They're diagnosable. There's a handbook. There's psychiatrists who diagnose these things, and they take all kinds of shapes and forms, right? From depression to, mood and anxiety disorders, to the psychotic illnesses, to, personality disorders, to substance use disorders. And many of them co-occur or kind of look the same, but it's a field of medicine. And it takes, in many instances, multiple things to treat them and to maintain the success of the treatment.
So thank you for that. I mean, with regards to recognizing, the differences, but also our system, like the healthcare system, Ontario's healthcare system, I don't think it's struggling. Like one of the things I think we are seeing, and not just in the healthcare sector, but in many other sectors, is people retiring. People who can retire early are retiring early, which puts a greater strain on the people who are still left. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the people coming in the volumes that we need.
Yeah.
So there's there's a support system that's not there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's infinite, probably. And I mean, lots of people healthcare workers, frontline workers worked incredibly hard during that whole pandemic and were exhausted. And as soon as they were done, or we're semi-done, the pandemic, we were so far behind.
Yeah.
And so much of the care we were used to doing, all the surgeries, all the cancer surgery. I remember people would show up at the emergency department of Michael Guerin, whose heart attack had been experienced weeks before, or the stroke that was left unseen, and the cancers that they far more advanced than they would have been, because people, I can remember going to get my screening colonoscopy during the pandemic, and a place that was usually so incredibly busy was vacant. And I thought, people aren't going and doing these things during the pandemic. So it's catch up. So on top of all the pressures that they faced was this incredible demand. And for people who wanted access to care and were very worried about their health. So a lot of people did, choose to retire choose to not work all the overtime they work during the pandemic, to dial it back, to take care of themselves a bit. And so for sure, there is a lack of human resources to the level at which people feel they need care.
Yeah.
And that's a hard problem to solve. So, it takes, 8 years to form a psychiatrist, or 4 years to form, and to remember that the health professionals that are coming into the market have been trained during this pandemic online. They aren't the same, or they don't have the same real life experiences that they would have had they, been trained 4 years before that.
Well, I know, because I remember listening to an interview about how they're trying to shorten the training processes so that people can get out there. Yeah. And so it's kind of like we had a bit of a standstill with COVID. It shut everything down, but it's not necessarily, and the catch up.
Yeah.
That's a reality. Like, I don't know if we'll ever catch up. We just have to acknowledge where we are.
Yeah.
And it's everywhere. Like, and this is a part of why I wanted to have this conversation with so many sector leaders, to say, I don't think it's one silver bullet. It is everybody coming together, but we have to kind of say, we've got to shake things up and do something differently.
For sure. It's going to take a lot of approaches. It's people valuing the health professions and wanting to do that. It's, maybe, and it's not uncontroversial. It's who do we allow to immigrate to this country? How quickly do we give them the credentials that they require to be able to work here? It's the burden on families in the meantime to take responsibility, caring for their parents, or caring for their children, or caring for their spouse, or caring for their friends, right? Yeah. Because there's not enough healthcare workers always to do that. It's trying to be patient and thankful for the ones that are there, right? Because many are checking their pension statements, saying, I could go do that. Like, I could go do something else, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's hard work. Nurses work 24/7. They work 12-hour shifts in many instances, right? They work Christmas Day. They work Boxing Day. Or they work New Year's Day. Or they work, Yeah. I was talking to a colleague who said 5 OR nurses quit one weekend to go work in private surgical centers because we're trying to catch up on things like cataract surgery and other minor surgeries. And, and guess what? Those nurses will make more than the ones that left the hospital, and they'll never work another stat holiday again, and they'll never work Christmas or New Year's or those things. They don't have to work overnight or be on call. It's there are delicate balances for people.
It scares me.
It is. And so, but they're fantastic careers, right? The sciences are amazing. The teamwork, what people know, the science that's coming out about the brain, for instance, in mental health and addictions. But, it's going to take, and it's not just catching up to where we were before. We're somewhere different. Yeah. Right? Our kids can't catch up for spending, a year and a half on Zoom school. They don't just bounce back from that. They're somewhere different, and they are different people because of it. And I find sometimes the problem is we expect them to be at a certain place and doing certain things because that's what we did, or that's what you expected them. And that's what every other, kids graduate from high school without writing an exam. My daughter started high school during the pandemic. None of that is normal high school experience.
No.
Be the good and the bad that comes with high school. They're just different. And I think we also have to figure out what the new standards and expectations are. And they're different, and it doesn't mean they're better or worse. Yeah. They're different. And I think we have to understand that. CAMH does a lot of work with youth wellness hubs. One just opened in Thorncliffe Park called Waihu's. Many opened up, 33 across the province, designed with youth for youth to get them to congregate, to come in and figure out what kinds of mental health supports might they need under their terms, not mine. I'm old. They look at me and they think I'm incredibly old. I allow them. Them to
my daughter thinks that too.
Of course. Didn't you think that of your parents, right? We have to reframe this as, what do they want? What will help them?
Yeah.
And, to live, to manage, to diagnose a mental illness, to adequately treat a mental illness takes a lot of things, right? It takes, obviously, a medical professional, and often the drugs and the therapies, this, psychopharmacology that goes with it. It requires often, what we call the talk therapies, like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavior therapy, the therapies of it. It takes your family sticking with you. These are not easy dynamics in families. and people with serious mental illness is very hard. And the fourth element is to keep young people in schools or in their jobs or in their university programs, because when they lose all that, it's even harder for them to redefine their lives. And, you know, a small part of that is a healthcare system, the way we imagine it. So much of it is education systems, employment systems, housing solutions, you know, interventions for families. You know, the talk therapies are largely privatized. There's some subsidized ones, but a lot of it is private, right? You know, it's $250 an hour probably for a psychologist.
Yeah.
Right? A private psychologist to do that. So there's so much we just as a system have to piece together. Right? When I worked in a cancer hospital, you know, the precision and understanding of the biology of the cancer and the testing and the stuff and the protocols for dealing with it. And then if you treated it precisely and it was the right kind of cancer, it usually, in most cases, goes away or is minimized. And or if you require palliative care, we could give you superior palliative care, as hard as that would be. Right? We can have people in a place like CAMH for a year helping them. And if they go home or go back to unhealthy environments or have nowhere to go home to, you know, none of that sticks. None of the treatments and systems and routines.
It's like undone.
And so that's why at a place like CAMH, we're so focused on what we call the recovery model. So it's learning to live with your mental illness and how to manage it, but giving you the skills and the tools to reconnect you. You can get a cooking certificate from George Brown College at CAMH. So when you leave, you have a certificate from a recognized educational institution to get a job. You know, a lot of people lost their connection to music or to art because of the years of mental illness. Like it takes so many other factors and systems to allow people to live with their mental illnesses. They're possible, but it's a totally different lens on what a healthcare system is.
And that's what I really want to talk about. Like, and we are talking about it. And that idea of something you said to me that really stuck is that, you know, when we go to the hospital and we're, you know, someone had a surgery or something. Oh, well, let's just go to the gift store.
Yeah.
Let's pick up like chocolates or pick up a card or pick up something like they needed. CAMH doesn't have.
No gift shop. That's right. CAMH is counted as the largest mental health hospital. An emergency department, over 500 beds for people who are admitted for their mental illness, and we treat far more on an outpatient basis. And there is no gift shop because there's not enough people who come by and who, now we're in the middle of West Queen West, there's beautiful shops and things, but many hospitals in Toronto are in neighborhoods where you can pick up a bouquet of flowers or whatever. So the degree to which families are no longer involved with people or their families have caused the people harm is, important. It's significant. And so we've got to, find new family, allow people to create new social connections, maybe the break patterns and linkages that have caused people.
I mean, that's so profound, right? And when you talk about a recovery program, so much of if someone gets a surgery, they go for physiotherapy and then the family like, oh, you got it. Or if you have diabetes, hey, your family as a whole should try and change their eating patterns to support you. But what I'm hearing here with no gift shop, like that's huge. How does that, when you have a recovery program, it's not just you dealing with what you have, but figuring out what supports are left and creating new supports. That is so hard. Like I feel like that recovery process is probably really challenging.
Yeah, it is. It is. And people with mental illness are, have such judgment, I mean, I don't know what the stats are, but I certainly know anecdotally how often families break up, parents break up because of the different approach to managing a young person's addiction.
Yeah.
Right? Do you take away their phone? Do you not? Do you, force them to go to school? Do you not? Do you, it's not a clear pathway the way it is with a cancer treatment, for instance. Yeah. And I often say to people, if your child is ill, get yourself some help. This will not be easy. We often blame ourselves, right? Did I do something? Maybe I wasn't home enough. Maybe I was angry too often. Maybe, maybe arguing with my spouse damages my kid. There's a lot, right? You'd never say, did my working too hard caused my child to have cancer.
Yeah, no, that's so true.
But what are these? Did I not pick up soon enough? Did I not, And as I said earlier, often there's underlying mental illness in some of the parents as well.
I mean, I know someone whose child was diagnosed with autism and then upon reflection realized, I have that. And I have just coped.
Yeah.
Without realizing I was coping. And all those stresses, like, one of the things in terms of survival, like we live in a society that's moving so much faster.
Yeah.
And the demands feel greater. Like even when you think about people driving, like Toronto driving, it's like people have so many things on their mind. They're racing, they're trying to cut traffic because they're late. Traffic in and of itself is always horrible.
Yeah.
But the underlying factor of time, like where do you find that time? Okay, my kid's been diagnosed with this. I've got to do all this care. I've got a job. I've got to put a roof over my, like there are all of these factors which feel like there's a weight that okay, that's a great idea, but I don't have time.
Yeah. No, they're intensive, right? Like how do you support a child who has a major mental illness? It's intensive, right? How do you parent a child?
Yeah.
Who has a major, some of the rules are different.
Yeah.
I think of parents of kids with ADHD, right? In the developing brain, or, they're not 1 person in 5 in any given year will have a mental illness. 1 in 2 in their lifetime will. These are common disorders.
1 in 5
in any given year, and 1 in 2 in a lifetime.
That's a 50-50 shot.
It is, for sure. Yeah. And, many are on a, lower end spectrum. I mean, it's 1 in 100 to have a disease like schizophrenia. But there's lots that can be unsettling in life.
So how do we prepare?
Well, I think we've got to learn. We've got to find the warning signs. We've got to figure out conditions that minimize the likelihood of it developing. We've got to go back to the, issue for children. Most of the kids with autism, we can figure it out by age 2.
Age 2.
Yeah, ish. Are they developing speech patterns? Are there social conditions?
Yeah.
Right. Some kids are slightly different.
Yeah.
Right. Things like depression and anxiety appear slightly older. Things like eating disorders older than that. Psychotic illnesses a little bit older than that. And some of them, start as a kid with a behavioral problem. Okay. And you think, wow, what can happen? And it's not just to punish and isolate kids. It's to figure out how to get them supports. And I've spoken to teachers that say, it's hard enough to teach a class. It's hard enough. They have 30 kids and they have all kinds of, they're inclusive environments and kids with, just developmental disabilities and others not coping at home and those kinds of things. Like you can't expect me to do anything else. But, the Ontario government's announced some increased supports to schools. I think we've got to wrap our arms around a school system and figure out how to help people.
Because that's really where we could diagnose it. We could help
or
minimize
early
the signs.
Yeah. And understand what it would take to support kids, right? We don't produce enough child psychiatrists in this country. We don't.
Why do you think that is?
Well, that's a complicated. Well, so I feel specifically with respect to child psychiatry, I think we're now understanding that mental illnesses are chronic disease of the young.
Yeah.
We now know what we're looking for a lot better earlier in life. We're picking it up in the adults and saying, whoa, now that you have it, could it be in your children? So I think part of it is that. And sometimes it doesn't, we'll never have enough child psychiatrists to do all that. I think some of it is diagnosable by family doctors. Some of it, we could wrap supports around schools differently.
I mean, we also know we've got like an attrition of teachers who are leaving.
Tough jobs.
We're like, what? You want me to do all these things? But it's not even in the education system, even in daycare providers.
Right.
Like all these people are in these essential roles. Are burnt out.
Yeah.
Are, trying to make ends meet. And like, I can't do it with the salary or I can't do it with the expectations that are placed upon me. And so I think when you say we got to wrap our arms around the education system,
we do.
I'm a fundamental believer, that the education system is that first line of defense of creating a strong, stable society.
Yeah, it is. It is. you know, and it's in some ways too late. It's not too late because, of course, we diagnose and treat in hospitals every day, but there were warning signs, right? People will say that, well, I wondered, you know, if my teenager's spending too much time in their room. I was worried about what they were doing after school. I think in sport, that's why sports teams or, you know, like all kinds of places, at least our youth congregate in spaces together, right? They're in schools, they're in universities or colleges, you know, to a high proportion. But I think at times we have to rethink, and it's easy for me to say, but rethink those systems. You know, how much pressure on kids to perform on tests or exams, or, you know, like look at the grades it takes to get into university.
Yeah.
You know, it's like 95 to get into some of these programs. What have those kids done but study to get those?
And not develop the social skills or the other aspects that are required to survive as a human being.
Yeah. You know, and all that pressure to perform on the test or the exam.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I'm an adult who's had a pretty successful career. Nothing has been as stressful in some ways as studying for final exams.
Yeah. Like it's true. I relate to that for sure.
Yeah. Like life is busy. There's times when I have big deadlines, times where I have to perform, but in my own experience, not as hard as it was to pass some of those university exams.
How we measure. I mean, I've had the fortune of studying in a different school system. And like, I remember when I was doing my master courses in Denmark, and the way that they do is oral tests.
There you go.
Which, you know, you think it's so interesting because in North America, we have so many tests that are written test-based. And it was interesting that the professor, like you sit in front of a professor in a few panels and then they ask you questions and then you talk about it. Yeah. Like, as opposed to rote memory and memorizing.
And everything's in their phone. Like everything is in your phone now.
Yeah.
And it's a whole lot of stress. And it doesn't test how much you remembered. A day later, a week later, a year later.
How do you apply it?
How do you apply it? You know, and so what are the standards? And these are kids now whose social development in school has been disrupted. And yes, some kids probably did okay to move to virtual school and back.
Yeah.
But I think many haven't.
The resiliency piece, you know, the anxiety that comes with performance. And also I feel like the anxiousness that comes with it. But also to some degrees, I feel like one thing for me is like, how do we build greater resiliency amongst our children? Because like the shy away, you know, like I have a little kid who's like, see someone and, you know, of course, like all other families, we isolated in our own bubble. So we didn't see very many people. So that, you know, what you had mentioned about signs of kids like not waving.
Yes. Yeah. And I think resiliency is a tough word. I mean, resilient means something bad happens and you bounce back.
Right.
And I don't think that can be the expectation. Right. We've gone somewhere and we're going to figure a new path, right? A new standard. And I think for many people, you know, they feel that they'll fail because they won't be where they were before. And that many people in certain social circumstances will be forever behind that. As you say, certain groups of certain economic levels, to be perfectly honest, could bubble. Yeah. I would think sometimes it takes a lot of people out working to keep Sarah Downey at home, feeling good and safe, or Sarah Downey's family, you know? Yeah. And that wasn't the case for so many people, right? Who had to go out and work every day, or kindergarten teachers teaching kindergarten with their own young children at home.
In the background,
In the background, you know, were those jobs not hard enough as they were? And we did that to save lives. And the evidence, I think, is pretty good that Canada did a good job of saving lives and doing those things. But, you know, we've got to look on the margins. We've got to see the trauma in people. We have to find that people are isolated because they're more likely to have a mental health problem.
Yeah.
Right? Because of trauma than people who've been, you know, protected to some degree. Trauma and wealth doesn't mean you won't have trauma. I don't mean that at all.
Yeah.
Right. There's lots of things in people's lives that have caused them trauma, but everything we have to do needs to be trauma informed. You know, we judge a lot of people with mental illness. As I said to you earlier, I was on the subway Friday night coming home at 11 o'clock at night. You know, in my car, there was somebody clearly, you know, like singing and chirping and doing things that are odd. And another guy who had a hospital blanket on him and a hospital tag on his wrist, sleeping on the subway. And I thought, where are they going to sleep tonight? What happens to them tonight?
Yeah.
Right? And how terrible it must be. We've seen at CAMH a 700% increase of crystal methamphetamine in the emergency department since 2014. I think, why are people using crystal meth? Well, it's incredibly cheap. You can make it, at home in a way. And it's a stimulant drug, right? People are trying to stay awake on the streets of Toronto to survive the night, to live the next day. So, there's a lot of judgment of people who have substance use problems and mental health disorders. Not all want treatment. Some may.
Yeah.
Right. And it takes, for sure, finding housing for people, but it's only one part of the recipe, right? It's finding treatment and compassion and community.
Yeah.
And hope and recovery.
Yeah.
And it's got to be so much more than what hospitals do.
It is true, because when you think about the example that you talked about TTC, taking that, oftentimes a lot of people don't want to go to the shelters.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're like, oh, I don't feel safe there.
Yeah.
And so what do? Okay, I'll take a streetcar.
Yeah.
That runs 24 hours and go from one end to the other. At least I'll stay warm. Toronto has some cold winters. Yeah. And at least I'll stay warm for an hour and a half ride, right? But even if you think about the interrupted sleep and not having enough sleep, that like, as a parent with a kid that would keep waking up, my days would be so brutal from that interrupted sleep.
Absolutely.
And housing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, all of these are so interconnected. Like, I feel like it's actually a cyclical piece, but there's so many components that I'm like, well, how do we lift the city up? How do we make things better? Like, and the one thing I hear from you very clearly is we need a different pathway. Like, what is existing now is a systemic structure that isn't working because life has changed. Yeah.
And we have to engage them to understand what would help them and not just judge it.
Right? So the stigma piece.
The stigma. Do we talk to people who are in those conditions? We judge them frequently, right? You had a choice, but to not get started on crystal meth or heroin or cannabis but when we look at CAMH at the use of substances, right? From grade 7 to grade 12, it starts, right? And it's not because they're curious. They're risk takers.
Yeah, at that age.
Of course. Weren't we all? Like, really? Didn't we all try stuff that age? It's, defining yourself and being a rebel. And it's part of your social development. But they get started on things that'll really change their brain paths. In my day, you had access-ish to alcohol. You had access to cigarettes, right? Neither of them very good, but neither of them were likely to kill you immediately. Over time, it certainly could. But now look, the crystal meth or, e-cigarettes that are even worse than
like
cigarettes and cannabis, right? Now the addiction to cannabis we see. So it takes a lot, right, to get at those issues. And what are young people masking? Is it just risk-taking? Like, let me see what it feels like?
Yeah.
Or is it some other, like I can't cope at school? It was interesting. When you look at young people and their admission to hospital for mental health disorders, you know what? It's a few weeks after school starts. It's around exam time. Like, this is where problems get exacerbated, right?
So if we could, if you could just wave the magic wand and make everything happen, what would that look like?
So
education system was something.
Yes, I think we have to wrap our arms around both our seniors, who I think are really suffering and very lonely. In the UK, they had a minister of loneliness. Yeah, no,
I think that's really profound, but also much needed. That move was really great. Like when I lived in Denmark, there was a program where to get housing for a young person, they would give them an apartment, but a part of their job was to go and visit these seniors and spend some time with them with a meal. And that was the social prescription.
Yes. We need compassionate societies. And I think we've got to figure out how we get to and support young people and young brains so that they grow up to have control over the lives and the world. Honestly, they're inheriting from us. With the conflict in the world and the state of the environment and a post-pandemic world, there's lots of reason for alarm. 59% of high school students in Ontario feel no hope for their future. 59%. It's the worst it's ever been, 40 years of surveying. Well, so maybe it's a blip. Who knows? We're surveying, the survey results for the next one will soon be out. Maybe it's a post-pandemic blip. Who knows? But, we've got to figure those things out and rethink some of the social fabric.
Yeah, I think that's the piece that's so important.
And this is a movement. My daughter is coaching rock climbing. I said, take Mental Health 101. You don't know what you see, right? Like, why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Like it's online. I mean, she's only 17, but still, why don't we all take it? I've taken it.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Like, how do you have conversations? I check in with people. During the pandemic, we used to say that all the time. Like, just go check, call them, see how they're doing. Calling is old school, but
text them or like, like,
are you okay? And listen to them. Are you okay? And if not okay, how can I help you get some help? And to make people feel safe to tell you what they and sometimes it's asking the question more than once.
It's true, right? Because people, for cultural reasons, stigma reasons, may not feel safe to share. Like, I feel like themes that are coming up for me is the desire to feel safe.
Yeah.
And that can mean so many things, like safety in a home, physically, emotionally, mentally, but also a space where people can fail.
Yeah.
Like, not be perfect. I don't have to be perfect. I don't, like the exam. If I don't pass, the stakes of being really high of getting into the right school for the right thing. And it's also not about catching up, because everybody for a period of 2.5 years, 3 years, whatever it is, experienced that shutdown.
Yeah. And if you look at absenteeism rates in schools, right? We did a whole shock to their systems, right? I mean, there's a lot of absenteeism. And what are high schools doing about that? And again, not easy. School boards are dealing with a lot of really tough things. Not enough teachers, burned out teachers, class sizes,
It's totally true. Like, I don't envy it. And I'm so grateful for all the frontline service workers, like on every sector. And this is why I have a commitment to, let's just be in focus. Let's put a lens on what life really looks like. Yeah. What does your life look like, as a frontline person?
Yeah. And on a positive note, I would say in the area of mental illness, I worked at CAMH before I worked at Michael Garron, so I've gone back to CAMH. And the brain science that's coming out of CAMH and other places is incredible, right? Yeah. We know a lot more about hearts and lungs and bones than we do about the brain, which is the most complex organ. But I'm actually really excited about what we're discovering and figuring out. We're identifying, impacts of things like concussions on brains or trauma on brains, or understanding how the brain starts to work, how it absorbs different drugs, how your genetic conditions and tests will affect the way you absorb and metabolize drugs. We do a lot of health policy work. And I think this is we're starting to figure it out. And my hope is that the diagnoses will be more specific. The treatments then could be more specific, that they'll be easier to maintain and to stay on top of. But I'd say I feel optimistic. I can't believe the talent in our organization and many others, people choosing to study the brain and hoping that it will be fundamentally different, right, for the next generation in terms of what we understand and how we'll treat it.
Well, I love that, right? Like, because, having this conversation is a difficult conversation, but recognizing that there's ways that we can make it better. And there are people, there's so many good people who are dedicating their lives because they know my research will be able to make a difference. Yeah. My presence, my conversation, and even us as regular human beings, calling someone, checking, hey, how's it going?
Yeah, okay.
Like a wellness check or something.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Like something as simple as that. Like, I think, you've talked about education system. Let's wrap our arms around the education system and what we can do to support it, and recognize we need to have different ways of moving forward. I just want to ask you about seniors. What do you think we should do for our seniors? Yeah,
so I think they're pretty isolated. I feel it with my own mother, who's alone in her house and won't leave. And We need better systems for seniors. I've thought, we've built youth wellness hubs. Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario is a big, solution for young people in different communities. It's almost like we need a seniors wellness hubs. And many great organizations do lots of great programming in these spaces. It's not to say that.
Yeah.
But I think they've been impacted.
Totally.
And, it's hard. They need to stay connected to family. Families are virtual. Technology starts to fail. My mother never properly learned to use a computer. And goodness for a phone. I learned to use a phone.
Yeah.
But, so at least I can call her. But it's very hard, right? I think, the rates of dementia, right? The aging population, the aging boomers.
Yeah, that's a reality, right?
It is a reality.
We're going to have to change that
dementia
really fast.
villages, naturally occurring retirement communities. We need to be sure we have good policies for seniors to not be alone in the activities that will keep their social connections going, because we know that makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. There is actually a Japanese restaurant that employs seniors.
Oh, wow.
And I think I don't know what it was, but it was something about how a lot of them have dementia.
Yeah.
But the fact that they're out there serving people, I think that they're 70% of the time they get the order wrong.
Yeah.
But the customers who come there are like, oh, that's fine, right? Okay, I got rice instead of noodles. That's totally fine. I'll enjoy it. But it's the interaction.
Oh, yeah.
Even if it's just an hour or two a day. Yeah. And for me, as a person raised in a culture where we revere our seniors, right?
Yes.
They are our elders.
Yeah.
Culturally, I have a warm spot for seniors. I really want to make a difference for seniors. And that matters.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, what can we do to help seniors? You know, and we, sometimes I feel the stigma around becoming old. Like my kid's like, oh, you're old.
Yes,
I'm like, yes, but I've learned some things.
Yeah. I mean, we used to do this when I worked at Michael Garron around flu season, pre-pandemic. A lot of seniors would die because of the flu every year. And so we'd get out and we'd try to vaccinate them in their homes. And we got into this habit of taking an occupational therapist with, nurses to go into homes and just check, are the cupboards bare? Are there trip hazards? Are there things that if you're going to go and, it's not easy to navigate, right? For many people in the winter, if you don't drive, if you don't feel physically strong.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to be locked up a bit more, do you even have the things that it takes to live? Right. And if you don't have family or people around you, how lonely and incredibly scary that must be. Yeah. So I love the idea that you said of the young people get housing and in return for which they help out. We've got to, we've got to lean in a bit and remember how scary and lonely it is for many people.
Yeah. And even for me, from a housing perspective as a realtor, there have been so many homes that elder, seniors, their partner has passed on, their kids have moved on, but they occupy a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom home, but they can only really access one floor. But that's their community for the past 30, 40, 50 years. And they're like, where am I going to go? Where, and that's a real struggle. And I think we have to answer that question. Because apart from the fact that we have a house affordability crisis, we have a housing crisis. These seniors need to feel safe in their community. They need to still be a part of it, but we need to rethink. Yeah. Do you share it? Do you rent it out? So that there's some sort of income. Yeah. And so
that's not easy at some points in your life to start to live with people, right? And I think many of us need to make those decisions much sooner.
It's true. I'm in a sandwich generation.
Yeah, right. So am I, taking care of the young and taking care of the old. And I look and I think, for some people, it's too late. It's too hard to make that. And or maybe they've never lived in those kinds of settings. I went to university. I lived in a residence.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe someday I'll feel that, slightly nicer residents, I hope.
Yeah, for sure.
and if, at least a kettle that works and a bit of a kitchen, but they're really important. It's a recognition of how important social interaction is to brain health.
Yeah.
That's so clear. And if you're not going to have it because you're in your beautiful home all by yourself with not enough people around you, it's going to affect your outlook and your ability to thrive. It makes dementia far worse.
There was a story that I heard about a woman who, a lot of women who put their lives, their careers on hold to raise their families.
Yep.
And now are on a pension that's quite limited.
Yeah.
And with housing prices, rental prices surging, what they can actually afford moving from a house to one floor to a basement. And there was a woman who said, let's get together a bunch of other women to do that. And I think we need more supports like that, and to formalize that. So it's not just like one-offs where someone has the energy to do it, but there's a need for that all across. And I think there is a message of hope here that there are I've had the privilege of speaking and knowing so many amazing leaders like yourself who are like, we got to break the mold. Like we got to not work in silos. Like how do we bring people together? And that work is happening. And on a much more grassroots basis, we as as common people can do something as simple as doing that check-in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Okay. So with every interview, I like to end with a quote.
Right.
And you kind of already gave the quote away, right? Do you want to share it with me?
Sure. So I don't have a single quote that governs my life.
Yeah.
But the great philosopher Ted Lasso had a lot of amazing quotes during that television series, and I was a huge fan of it. But my favorite one, I think, is "Be curious, not judgmental." And I think when it comes to mental illness and the state of mental health in our country, in our city, in our families, we've got to be curious and helpful, not judgmental. Nobody chooses this. It's not their fault. They experience that. And we've got to reach out and explore it and create safe spaces for people to talk about it and to seek help.
It is so on point. It is so profound.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for checking out this episode. You want to make sure to subscribe, and share so that you don't miss out on the next In Focus episode on topics that matter to you.